If Ilocano, Cebuano, Kapampangan, Waray, Hiligaynon, if these are just dialects, then French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, all of these are just dialects, right? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but that is exactly the problem. You see, Cebuano, Ilocano, Waray, Kapampangan, Bicol, Pangasinan, Hiligaynon, Meranao, Bahasasug, each of them have millions of native speakers. Each of them have complex grammar, rich literature, and much deeper history. And yet, you hear millions of people, millions of Filipinos, casually downgrade them as just dialects. So here's the problem. When you shrink a language to a mere dialect, you're actually diminishing the people who speak it. You're diminishing and chipping away at their identities, at their dignities. You're chipping away and diminishing how our kids see themselves. You chip away at how the worlds value us and see us as a people. So calling a language just a mere dialect is not entirely harmless. It's not just words. It is like, erasing an entire country off the map and pretending it never existed, even though it's just actually there, or it was all along. So by the end of the video, you won't just know the difference between languages and dialects, but you also understand and be able to explain it to others in a way that makes people stop, think, and actually listen. Mabuhay! Or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo! Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araulio, your friendly Pinoy historian and culture bearer. So in today's video, before we even dive deeper and get into the definitions, we must first understand the bigger picture. You see, unknown to millions of Filipinos, the Philippines is not just home to just one language with a few variations. We actually have over 180 languages, over 180 living languages. And each language carries its own way of thinking, storytelling, and seeing the world. Yet so many of them get mislabeled simply as dialects, implying that they're just nothing but, side branches of something bigger, something that is far more important. And this matters because when a language is dismissed, it doesn't just, lose status in textbooks or classrooms. It loses ground in people's hearts. Kids start thinking that their own mother tongues are less educated, while the elders may start holding back stories and passing down wisdom just because they may seem out of place. And little by little, that living bridge between generations start to crumble. That living link to our deeper roots starts to fade. And I've actually been on this journey myself. You see, growing up in the Philippines, I barely heard our own native languages in schools. I was actually punished in school for speaking my mother tongue, even though we're in the middle of my hometown in Angeles City in Pampanga. And I thought that was normal. So growing up in the Philippines, going through the school system in the Philippines, we were taught in schools that English was the language of the educated, and right next to it was Tagalog or Filipino, but not the rest. The rest are just mere dialects. But the moment I started learning baybayin at the age of 7, the moment I started mastering kulitan, aka the Kapampangan script, the moment I started speaking my own mother tongues, both Tagalog and Kapampangan, loudly and proudly, something shifted. And I wasn't just, learning words. And if you think about it, I was reclaiming a part of me that I had been told to set aside. And to be honest, it made me stand taller, speak louder, and see my roots not as baggage but as sources of strength and empowerment. So if you're new here, I've been teaching our people's history through our indigenous scripts like Baybayin and Kulitan for over 12 to 15 years now. And when I was at UC Davis, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to teach one of the first college courses specifically dedicated to Baybayin and Kulitan outside the Philippines. And in those classes, I saw firsthand how learning these indigenous scripts could light up a room, sparking pride, curiosity, and a deeper sense of connection to our people's roots, despite the fact that we're thousands of miles away from the motherland. So these languages and indigenous scripts have connected me back to our people's history, and teaching them in classrooms and community spaces has shown me how they carry the dignity, the humor, and the resilience of our ancestors. So the languages versus dialect debate is not really just for academics, but really more about our identity, our people's dignity, and cultural survival. It is about how, you talk to your lola, how your children will understand you, and how we keep our own histories alive. So before we define what is a language and what is a dialect, let us agree on one thing. The words we choose to use, these are not just words with definitions or fixed definitions. They actually have real impact. They actually have real consequences. And by the way, throughout this video, I'll be using Tagalog and Filipino interchangeably because unknown to many, in linguistics, experts agree that Filipino, or the official language we now call Filipino in the Philippines, is really just the standardized Tagalog spoken in Manila, the Tagalog dialect of the capital, Manila. But don't worry, I'll explain how Tagalog became Filipino in a future video, so stay tuned. Okay, so Kuya Kirby, what exactly is the real difference between a language and a dialect? The short answer is it's complicated. I mean, yes, it can be complicated, but it is also quite simple. So let me explain this to you in a way that is easier to understand. So a language is a complete system of communication with its own grammar, vocabulary, and rules. So if two people speak different languages, they cannot really understand each other without learning the other language. So think of Tagalog and Cebuano, or Ilocano and Waray. No matter how slowly you speak, if you haven't learned the other language, you're lost. Now, a dialect, on the other hand, is a variation within the same language, a branch within the same language. The grammar is mostly the same, and the core vocabulary overlaps enough that speakers can still understand each other, even if they notice the differences in accent, intonation, or even certain words. So for example, the English spoken in Britain is a different dialect than the one spoken in the United States or the one spoken in Canada or Australia. And even in the Philippines, we have our own English dialect in the Philippines. But then, here is where it gets tricky for Filipinos. The Tagalog spoken in Metro Manila, Bulacan, Batangas, and Cavite are all dialects of the Tagalog language. A Batangueño might stretch vowels or use older forms that sound too formal or too deep to a Manileño. Bulacan's Tagalog tends to sound more neutral than the other two. Now, fun fact, Bulacan's Tagalog was also the one that used to shape how Tagalog was spoken on TV and radio. Meanwhile, Cavite's Tagalog, especially in older towns, can sound a bit, more rougher or more accented in rhythm. Nevertheless, people from all these regions can talk to each other just fine without having to switch languages. Same with Kapampangan. The version spoken in Upper Pampanga, in places like Angeles or Mabalacat and Tarlac, might sound a little bit different from how Kapampangan is spoken in coastal towns like Lubao or Macabebe. And most of the variation comes down to vocabulary. Although some places like Sasmuan and Lubao, they also have their own intonation patterns. Intonations that are different from those in Capas Tarlac or in Angeles. And then in towns like Sasmuan, Candaba, and Lubao, you'll sometimes hear older vowel shifts, like the way certain syllables are pronounced. And actually, if you want to hear one of the oldest dialects of Kapampangan, it is actually the one spoken in Bataan. Now the difference stand out, but they don't really block understanding. Kapampangan speakers, whether you're from Tarlac, Bataan, Pampanga, or Nueva Ecija, or even Bulacan, you can still understand each other without shifting languages. Now, the easiest way to remember the difference between languages and dialects is this. So imagine two people from different places or roots. If they cannot understand each other without first learning each other's native tongue, then they're actually speaking different languages. But if they can still follow along, even with different accents, rhythms, or a few unique words and phrases, they're still speaking dialects of the same language. Now, when you know the difference, when you understand the difference, then you can actually push back against this myth. You can actually push back and defend the respect that every language and every dialect actually deserves. So, Kuya Kirby, if that is the real definition of languages versus dialects, if that's the real difference, then how exactly did we end up using the word dialect so wrong in the Philippines? Now, to understand this, to answer this question, we've got to go back, way back into our history. During the Spanish era, missionaries were some of the first known outsiders to document our local languages. But the thing is, yes, they documented our languages and native scripts, but they didn't just do it or write them down just for fun. They did it to conquer and convert our people. And so the languages most useful for spreading religion, like Tagalog and Kapampangan near Manila, the seat of colonial power, or Cebuano in the Visayas, these languages got more attention and they become more prestigious. But to be fair to the Spaniards, they actually saw and labeled our languages. They called them as languages in their own right. But then, fast forward to the American era. So now English became the new ruler of the classroom. American teachers arrived, armed with lesson plans and Uncle Sam's own agenda to unify the islands under a single language for governance and so-called progress. Now Tagalog, which was already elevated during the Spanish era, was now positioned and later chosen as the basis for a new national language, aka Filipino or Filipino, in the 1930s. Meanwhile, the rest of the native languages, like Cebuano, Ilocano, Waray, Kapampangan, and so many others, were all reduced in official documents, in official policies, and school textbooks to just mere dialects of Filipino, even when they were completely separate languages and not mere branches of Tagalog or Filipino. So picture this, a friar teaching catechism in Tagalog. Then decades later, Or even centuries later, an American teacher in the same town drilling kids in English. And in the middle of it all, a Filipino child, a native child, quietly told that the language spoken at home is just a dialect, not important enough for the classroom, not prestigious enough for official use. From that point on, dialect in the Philippines stopped meaning what it actually means in linguistics. It's no longer a linguistic definition. It became a colonial ranking system, with English at the top, then followed by Filipino, based on Manila's Tagalog, while everything else, including other Tagalog dialects, pushed down the ladder. And that is why, to this very day, you still hear millions of people, millions of Filipinos, still casually call Ilocano, or Cebuano, or Waray, or others, just mere dialects. And not because that is the correct definition, but because colonial miseducation made us believe that it was. And again, this is not just some harmless mistake. Calling a language a mere dialect actually have real impact and real damage. You see, when you call someone's language, when you downgrade someone's language to a mere dialect, you're telling them, often without realizing it, you're telling them that their words, their stories, their cultures, their identities are somehow less. And the reality is, people hear that message. And when you have a system that punishes a child for speaking their own mother tongue in schools, then some of them start speaking less and less of their mother tongues. Others drop it completely. Many forget their own mother tongues. Because we have this system in the Philippines that makes people think that to sound more educated, to sound more smart, to sound more modern, that they have to speak in English. And to sound more Filipino, they have to speak in Filipino or Tagalog, but not the rest. The rest are just dialects, not languages. But sadly, the loss doesn't just stop there. Imagine a child who can no longer talk to their grandparents in the language they grew up with, the language of their ancestors. The old jokes, the lullabies, the family stories, they don't really translate perfectly. Not every word can be translated. Something is always missing. And once that gap opens, it widens very fast. And as mentioned in many of my videos, every language carries a way of seeing the world. Its own rhythm, its own wisdom, its own way of naming what matters. So when a language fades away, you don't just lose the words, you lose an entire worldview. The way your ancestors mapped out the stars, the way they describe love, grief, or even the oceans. Just think about it. The knowledge they passed down through the centuries, knowledge and wisdom in farming, fishing, healing, and living, they just fade away along with the language. And that is why in linguistics, when a language dies, an entire worldview dies. An entire way of seeing the world and the universe dies. And sadly, across the Philippines, our indigenous oral traditions like the epics that once took days to perform are now remembered by only a handful of elders. Indigenous knowledge tied to local languages are sadly disappearing before our very eyes, before many of them are ever written down. Many may not even realize this, but losing respect for your own language, for your own mother tongue, can also mean losing respect for yourself, for who you are. And let's be honest, respect for who you are, for your people, your heritage, and your roots is something that no one should have to give up. And in the Philippines, classrooms didn't just teach us how to read or do math. They also quietly rewired how we think about languages, how we think about our mother tongues. So for decades, most kids in the Philippines were taught almost entirely in English, or now both English and Filipino, which is actually based on Tagalog. Meanwhile, other native languages, even those with millions of native speakers, the major ones, they were treated as something unofficial, something just for casual conversations, something second class. They were never treated as a serious part of our education. They were never treated as a serious part of our identities. So if you grew up speaking Ilocano, Ibanag, Itawes, Kapampangan, Waray, Bahasa Sug, Meranao, Magindanaoan, Iranon, the moment you step into the school system in the Philippines, you were told directly or indirectly to set those languages aside, to set your mother tongues aside. You were taught that those languages are basically worthless dialects. Now, this was a direct result of colonial-era policies that was carried over into the modern school system in the Philippines, and the message was clear. To succeed, you needed to set aside your own mother tongues in favor of a national language called Filipino, or a colonial language called English. Now over time, over the decades, this created an invisible ranking. It implied that some languages were considered educated, while the others were treated as less. And many of their speakers, especially children, were even punished. Now in 2013, the Mother Tongue-based Multilingual Education Policy, or MTBMLE, aimed to change that. And on paper, it meant that kids from kindergarten to grade 3 could learn in one of the 19 recognized regional languages. And the goal was to boost comprehension, confidence, and cultural pride. But the sad reality is, many schools across the country lack the teachers, the materials, and funding to actually make it work. The implementation was uneven. Many schools actually struggled. And in 2024, the Department of Education suspended MTBMLE as a national standard, reversing what could have been a turning point for our languages. So here's the heart of it. No matter where you are in the world, whether in the Philippines or across the diaspora, what our children hear at home and in schools shape how they see themselves. If they hear that their language matters, they'll believe that they matter. But if they hear that it's just a dialect or that it doesn't even matter, then sadly, they'll learn how to shrink a part of themselves to fit someone else's standard, to fit someone else's narrative. So picture this, your 7-year-old kid sitting in class, reading their very first book in their mother tongues, in their lola's language, in your own language. Their eyes light up, the story feels familiar, and the words feel like home. And although it may seem simple, that moment plants a seed of confidence, of empowerment and pride that can last a lifetime. If you think about it, when we teach our kids in our own languages, in our own mother tongues, we're not just giving them, words to learn. We're actually giving them roots to grow and even wings to reach further than we ever could. Okay, now let's do some mythbusters. Let's tell us some of the biggest myth and biggest misconceptions about languages and dialects in the Philippines. So myth number 1, these are just dialects of Filipino. No, they're not. No, calling them dialects, that is actually the colonial hangover talking. Cebuano is not a branch of Filipino or Tagalog. Neither is Hiligaynon, Waray, or any other regional languages. These are full languages, languages of their own right, with their own grammar, vocabulary, and centuries of literature. Some even have distinct writing systems, native scripts that predate Spanish arrival, like Baybayin for Tagalog, Kulitan for Kapampangan, Kurdita for Ilocano, Badlit in the Visayas, and so many more. Calling them dialects is like saying that French is a dialect of Spanish, or that Spanish and French are dialects of Italian. That is just simply wrong. And when you erase that distinction, you erase the entire culture and the history behind it. Myth number 2, these dialects are not developed. But let me ask you this, developed compared to what? I mean, Ilocano has its own ancient epics passed down for centuries. Kapampangan produced some of the earliest printed books in Southeast Asia. Tausug poetry has moved people for generations, carrying histories, values, and philosophies long before the Spaniards even arrived. And even the so-called smaller languages. These indigenous languages like Aitamagindi, Aitamaganchi, Itawes, Ibanag, and the many languages spoken by the Lumads of Mindanao, they all have very rich oral traditions, have complex grammar, and unique ways of seeing the world, unique ways of understanding the universe. And if you think that these languages are not developed enough to be called languages, then maybe the yardstick that we are using to measure these things, to measure languages, was actually built to measure only European norms, only Western standards. And that is a problem with the yardstick or the measuring tape, and not the fault of the languages. Okay, so myth number 3, having too many languages will only divide us. Now, this one is actually tricky because this myth is rooted in fear. But if we look at our people's history, it tells us a different story. Before colonialism, our islands were thriving hubs of multilingual societies. Trade, diplomacy, and alliances happened across dozens of languages, often without conflict. Merchants in the Visayas could bargain with traders from Mindanao. Traders from China, Malacca, Japan could all come to Luzon and trade with our ancestors using different languages. Leaders could form treaties and alliances without sharing a mother tongue, and intermarriages connected whole communities. For example, unknown to many, intermarriages were very common among Southeast Asians, like the royal families of Oranao, Brunei, Sulu, Luzon, Maguindanao. Even those from what is now Malaysia are actually blood related to one another. And it wasn't just the royals, even the everyday people. Throughout the islands of Southeast Asia, it was pretty common for households to have multiple languages and even multiple religions within the same families. I mean, just imagine the many mother tongues being shared and exchanged in the family gatherings. So if you think about it, and if you were to be honest, Animosities and divisions does not come from having too many languages or too many different mother tongues. Division and animosities come from inequalities and exclusion. It comes from discrimination and exploitation. Your mother tongues are not just dialects. It is your language, your culture, your history, your identity, your dignity, and they deserve to live. They deserve to be spoken out loud. So let us call them for what they are: languages. When you speak your language, you're not just talking in your mother tongue. You're actually keeping an entire way of understanding the universe alive and thriving. Every word carries the rhythm, the humor, and the wisdom of your people, our people. And every sentence is a thread in a story that has been told for generations and across oceans for thousands of years. So speak it daily, even in small moments. Greet your family in your mother tongue. Teach your kids, your siblings, or even your friends a new word every day. Learn every day. And if you hear someone calling your mother tongue or language just a dialect, don't take a fight, but gently correct them. Not to win an argument, but to remind them of its worth. Now, I know it may sound like a lot of pressure, but here's the truth. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. You do not have to be fluent to make a difference. Even a few phrases spoken with care can spark curiosity, can spark pride and empowerment in others. You can revive songs, proverbs, or even the many stories you heard from your elders. You can always bring those words into your art, your social media, your everyday life. And let's face it, we all have a part to play. So whether you speak Tagalog, Waray, Cebuano, Ilocano, Itawes, Ibanag, Aytamagindi, Aytamaganchi, Kapampangan, or any of our indigenous living languages in our islands, we are all part of their survival, each and every one of us. Like for me, for example, embracing our mother tongues and learning to write and master our indigenous scripts like Baybayin and Kulitan. This has been a journey of self-empowerment. Writing in Baybayin and Kulitan, speaking in both Tagalog and Kapampangan proudly and loudly, it really deepened my connection to our roots, to our history, to our people. And actually, in fact, it is the very reason why I started making videos like this, why this channel exists. So whenever I teach Baybayin and Kulitan, whenever I teach our people's histories, whether in college campuses in California, high school students in Pampanga, or with the Filipino children in Brunei, I can see how reconnecting with our own indigenous scripts could actually spark pride, curiosity, and a deeper sense of belonging, a sense of empowerment, not just for the students, but also for myself. And every time I teach these in the classroom or in casual conversations, I feel the pride of carrying forward something that our own ancestors fought to preserve. Because languages do not fade through being weak. They fade away and disappear when we stop using them. And they only thrive and survive when we choose to uplift them. And we have to face the truth that, the reality that, our islands and our diverse people have always been multilingual. Being able to speak multiple languages have always been one of our strengths. So choose to speak it. Choose to teach it. Choose to respect it. Because when you respect your language, when you respect your mother tongue, you're also respecting yourself, your ancestors, and the generations yet to come. Respect. And as the old saying goes, in Tagalog, ang hindi marunong magmahal sa kanyang sariling wika ay mas masahol pa sa hayop at sa malansang isda. Or in Kapampangan, masalingangalyang epalak, kinglanam ning mebilasangasan, ing taong alampakamal, kingamano ng siswan. Those who do not know how to love and value and treasure their mother tongues are far worse than a savage beast and reeks worse than the stench of a rotten fish. And let's be honest, nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants that. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't want to stink worse than a rotten fish. So if you're interested in learning more about the languages of the Philippines or how Tagalog became Filipino and why Filipinos don't even speak Spanish, then make sure to watch my other videos for more discussions on our people's histories, cultures, and everything in between. And if you want to support my channel and dive deeper into these topics, you can also check out my books, coloring books, ebooks, and merch in the links below. Maraming salamat po o in Kapampangan dakal pong salamat kay Kongan in Ilocano agyang manaklaunay. And in Magindanawan, syukran na benal. See you next time in Tagalog kita-kits in Kapampangan, Mikitiks and in Binisaya, kita-ita. And in Bahasa Sug, balik isab.